France and America, bound by the
There are men who shape history with swords, and men who shape it with words. Benjamin Franklin was neither a warrior nor a king, yet his quiet genius helped birth a nation. He walked among philosophers and peasants alike, a man who flew kites into storms and signed documents that changed the world. Tonight, let us trace the footsteps of a printer's son who became a founder, a diplomat, an inventor, a voice of reason in an age of revolution. His story unfolds not in thunder, but in the steady glow of lamplight over parchment, in the careful pull of a printing press, in the soft crackle of electricity through wire. Close your eyes and drift back to cobblestone streets and candlelit rooms, where one man's curiosity became a legacy that still whispers through the ages. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. A gentle tap on subscribe keeps these stories alive, a soft companion for nights when the past feels closer than the present. No rush, no urgency, just an invitation to rest here again, whenever you need a place to wander before dreams take over. Boston in the early 1700s smelled of salt and smoke, a city pressed between ocean and ambition. The harbor churned with ships carrying goods and gossip from across the Atlantic, while narrow streets twisted between wooden buildings that leaned toward each other like old friends sharing secrets. In one of these modest homes, on a cold January morning in 1706, Josiah Franklin welcomed his 15th child into the world. The boy was named Benjamin, and nothing about his arrival suggested destiny. He was simply another mouth to feed, another soul in a household already stretched thin by the demands of a large family and the humble profits of a soap and candle maker's trade. Josiah looked at his infant son and saw practicality. The boy would need a trade, something useful, something that would keep him fed when childhood faded into the hard realities of colonial life. For a brief moment, Josiah considered the church. Young Benjamin showed intelligence early, a quickness with words and numbers that stood out even among his siblings. Perhaps he could become a clergyman, a respectable path for a bright boy from modest means. But clergy required years of expensive education, Latin and Greek and theology, costs that would drain a family already counting every shilling. The dream lasted only as long as it took Josiah to calculate the impossible arithmetic of tuition and survival. Benjamin attended Boston Latin School for less than a year before being pulled back to the practical world of work. So the boy learned to cut wicks and pour tallow, to shape candles in molds while his father talked of frugality and virtue. It was honest work, necessary work, but young Benjamin's mind wandered beyond the workshop walls. He read everything he could find, borrowing books from anyone willing to lend them, devouring poetry and essays and arguments like a man starving for something he couldn't quite name. His father noticed this hunger and recognized it as both gift and danger. A boy who read too much might dream too much, might become dissatisfied with the solid, dependable life of a tradesman. Still, Josiah wanted to nurture that spark without letting it burn away his son's future. When Benjamin was 12 years old, his father made a decision that would change everything. He apprenticed the boy to his older son James, who had recently returned from England with the skills and equipment to run a printing press. The print shop stood on Queen Street, a place where news became tangible, where words transformed into something you could hold in your hands. James Franklin was 21, ambitious, and determined to make his mark in a city where information was power. He had brought back not just a press but also the knowledge of London's printing houses, the rhythm of typesetting and ink rolling, the careful dance of creating pages that people would pay to read. For Benjamin, stepping into that shop was like entering a cathedral of knowledge. The smell of ink and paper replaced the smell of tallow and smoke. The mechanical precision of arranging lead type letter by letter, word by word, line by line, satisfied something deep in his orderly mind. But more than the craft itself, it was access that changed him. A printer's shop was a crossroads for ideas. Pamphlets, essays, books, newspapers, everything passed through those doors, and Benjamin read it all. He developed a system, a discipline born from necessity and desire. After finishing his daily work, often past dark, he would retreat to whatever corner held enough light to read by. He taught himself arithmetic from books, then moved on to navigation and geometry. He discovered John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and read it until the pages grew soft. He found volumes of Plutarch's Lives and lost himself in ancient heroes and their complicated moralities. He stumbled upon essays by Addison and Steele in The Spectator and studied their style like a musician learning scales, copying their sentences by hand, then trying to reconstruct them from memory, comparing his versions to the originals, learning through imitation and failure and slow improvement. Writing, he discovered, was not a gift from heaven but a skill built through practice, through attention, through the willingness to be wrong and try again. But the print shop was not paradise. James was a demanding master, quick to criticize and slow to praise. The relationship between the brothers carried all the complexity of family mixed with commerce. James saw himself as the teacher, the authority, the one who had given his younger brother an opportunity. Benjamin saw himself as more than an apprentice, he was a contributor, a thinker, someone whose ideas were worth hearing. This tension simmered quietly at first, manageable in the rhythm of daily work. Then James started printing Boston's third newspaper, the New England Courant, and the simmering tension began to boil. The New England Courant was different from the careful, deferential newspapers that Boston was accustomed to. James Franklin filled its pages with satire and criticism, poking at the establishment, questioning authority with a boldness that made some readers laugh and others reach for their pens to write furious rebuttals. It was provocative, sometimes reckless, and it quickly became the talk of the city. Benjamin watched his brother's newspaper grow in influence and notoriety, and something stirred within him, a desire not just to observe but to participate, to add his own voice to the conversation echoing through Boston streets. But he was 16, an apprentice, someone expected to work quietly and learn humbly. His opinions, he knew, would be dismissed simply because of his age and position. So Benjamin became someone else. Late at night, by candlelight, he crafted letters written from the perspective of a middle-aged widow named Silence Dogood. She was clever and opinionated, observant and witty, concerned with the moral fabric of society and unafraid to point out its fraying edges. She wrote about education and hypocrisy, about the treatment of women and the pretensions of the wealthy. Her voice was sharp but never cruel, funny but always purposeful. Benjamin folded each letter carefully and slipped it under the print shop door in the early morning hours, before anyone arrived for work. James found these letters intriguing, even delightful. He published them eagerly, and Boston responded with enthusiasm. People talked about Silence Dogood at dinner tables and in taverns, debating her observations, laughing at her jokes, wondering who this insightful widow might be. For months, Benjamin kept his secret, watching his words circulate through the city under another's name, feeling the strange thrill of influence without recognition. When he finally revealed himself as the author, he expected surprise, perhaps even admiration. Instead, James grew cold with resentment. His younger brother had deceived him, had proven himself talented in a way that felt like competition rather than collaboration. The praise that Silence Dogood received became a wedge between them, and what had been tension became something harder and more bitter. James began treating Benjamin more harshly, finding fault where there was none, using his authority as master to remind his brother of his place. Sometimes the criticism turned physical, a shove, a blow, the kind of discipline that was legally permitted between master and apprentice but felt more like cruelty between brothers. Benjamin endured it, but endurance has limits. He was contracted to serve his apprenticeship until he turned 21, 5 more years of subordination stretching ahead like a prison sentence. The law bound him to his brother, to this shop, to this increasingly suffocating relationship. But young Benjamin Franklin was already learning that laws could be circumvented, that rules often had gaps for those clever enough to find them. When James published something that offended the Massachusetts authorities, he was briefly jailed and forbidden from continuing the Courant. To keep the newspaper running, the brothers devised a scheme. They would transfer the publication officially to Benjamin's name, making him the publisher on paper while James continued to control everything behind the scenes. To make this arrangement appear legitimate, James returned Benjamin's original apprenticeship papers, marked as fulfilled. But privately, secretly, he had Benjamin sign new papers binding him just as firmly, hidden documents that would ensure his continued service. It was a deception aimed at the authorities, but it created an opportunity that Benjamin saw with perfect clarity. Those secret papers had no legal standing. If he chose to leave, the hidden contract could not be enforced without James admitting to the very fraud they had perpetrated together. The decision formed slowly, like ice crystallizing on a winter window. Every harsh word, every undeserved blow, every moment of being treated as less than he was, they accumulated into something Benjamin could no longer carry. He was 17, standing at a crossroads between duty and freedom, between the known misery and the unknown possibility. Boston had become too small, too tangled with family obligation and bruised pride. He needed distance, space to become whoever he might be without the weight of James's resentment pressing down on him. So in the autumn of 1723, Benjamin Franklin made the choice that would define his character for the rest of his life. He ran. He could not simply book passage on a ship leaving Boston. His brother would have been alerted, the apprentice retrieved, the escape undone before it began. So Benjamin arranged his departure quietly, through a friend who convinced a ship's captain that the young man needed to leave for reasons too delicate to discuss openly. Perhaps a girl in trouble, perhaps some youthful indiscretion, the kind of story that made men nod knowingly and ask no further questions. Benjamin sold his books to raise money for the journey, parting with the volumes he had cherished, trading accumulated knowledge for the chance to accumulate more somewhere else. He boarded the ship with almost nothing, leaving behind family, familiarity, and the only life he had ever known. The journey from Boston to New York took 3 days, and the weather turned fierce as if testing his resolve. The small vessel pitched and rolled through autumn storms, water breaking over the bow in cold sheets that soaked everyone on deck. Benjamin had never been a strong sailor, and the nausea that gripped him felt like more than just the motion of waves. It was the physical manifestation of uncertainty, of having severed the ropes that tied him to everything safe and predictable. He curled in whatever shelter he could find, stomach churning, mind racing between regret and determination. When the ship finally entered New York's harbor, he stumbled onto the dock feeling hollowed out and reborn simultaneously, a boy who had chosen exile over submission. New York in 1723 was smaller than Boston, rougher around the edges, a city still finding its identity. Benjamin sought out William Bradford, the colony's only printer, hoping that his skills with type and press might earn him employment. He arrived at Bradford's shop disheveled from travel, looking every bit the runaway apprentice he was, and tried to present himself with a confidence he did not quite feel. Bradford was kind but honest. There was no work available in New York. The shop was small, the business steady but not growing, and Bradford already had help from his son. However, the older man saw something in this earnest young visitor that moved him to offer guidance rather than just rejection. His son had a printing shop in Philadelphia, Bradford explained, and there might be opportunity there. The city was growing, hungry for news and commerce, and another pair of skilled hands might find welcome. Philadelphia. The name hung in the air like a promise wrapped in fog. It was farther south, farther from James and Boston and the possibility of being dragged back to finish a contract he had broken. Benjamin thanked Bradford with a gratitude that went beyond words, and set out again with directions and diminishing funds. The route required traveling first by boat across the bay to Perth Amboy, then overland across New Jersey, then another boat down the Delaware River to Philadelphia. It should have been straightforward, but nothing about Benjamin Franklin's journey into independence was easy. The boat crossing to Perth Amboy encountered a squall that tore the sails and left them rowing desperately through rough water. One passenger, drunk and careless, fell overboard, and Benjamin grabbed him by the hair and hauled him back into the boat, saving a life even as his own future remained utterly uncertain. They made land eventually, cold and exhausted, and Benjamin began the 50-mile walk across New Jersey with a handful of other travelers. It rained steadily, turning the roads to mud that sucked at their shoes with every step. They walked through forests where the trees pressed close and the path disappeared into shadows, through small settlements that offered little comfort to strangers. Benjamin's clothes grew soaked and heavy, his body ached with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He had left Boston with barely enough money, and now the coins in his pocket felt lighter with each mile, each meal purchased from suspicious innkeepers, each night spent in rooms that smelled of mildew and other people's lives. By the time he reached the Delaware River and found a boat heading to Philadelphia, he was nearly penniless, feverish from exposure, and beginning to wonder if freedom was worth this much hardship. The boat ride down the Delaware should have been the easiest leg of his journey, but even this turned complicated. The wind died completely, leaving them to row through the night, fighting the current in darkness while Benjamin took his turn at the oars despite his fever. They drifted past Philadelphia in the pre-dawn hours, too exhausted to notice, and ended up miles downstream before realizing their mistake. Finally, on a Sunday morning in October 1723, Benjamin Franklin stepped onto the Market Street wharf in Philadelphia. He was 17 years old, filthy, exhausted, and alone. His pockets held perhaps a single Dutch dollar. He had no friends in this city, no family, no reputation, no prospects. He was exactly as far from everything as he needed to be. He walked up Market Street looking for food, for anything to quiet the hunger that had been his companion for days. He found a bakery and asked for 3 pennies worth of bread, not knowing the local customs or currency. The baker handed him 3 large puffy rolls, far more than Benjamin expected. He tucked one under each arm and began eating the third as he walked, too hungry to care how ridiculous he looked. The streets were quieter than Boston's, wider and more orderly, laid out in a grid that suggested planning and intention. Philadelphia was William Penn's holy experiment, a place built on principles of tolerance and fair dealing, where Quakers and other seekers had come to build something different from the rigid hierarchies of older cities. Benjamin walked through this newness still chewing his roll, and noticed a young woman standing in a doorway watching him pass. Her name was Deborah Red, though he would not learn that until later. She would remember this moment for the rest of her life, the strange boy with the puffy rolls, looking lost and determined simultaneously. He found a Quaker meeting house and went inside, not for worship exactly, but for rest. The silent meeting suited his exhaustion perfectly. He sat among the quiet contemplation of strangers and promptly fell asleep, his body finally surrendering to the accumulated weight of flight and uncertainty. When he woke, the meeting had ended and people were filing out, casting curious glances at the sleeping stranger. One kind soul directed him to a rooming house where he might find a bed, and Benjamin dragged himself there with the last of his energy. He paid for a room with nearly the last of his money, climbed the stairs, and collapsed into sleep that lasted well into the next day. When Benjamin Franklin woke in that Philadelphia boarding house, the morning light streaming through unfamiliar windows, he faced a question that would define the next decade of his life: who would he become? He had run from one identity, the subordinate apprentice, the younger brother forever in shadow, but had not yet built another to take its place. Philadelphia offered him something Boston never could: anonymity as opportunity, the chance to construct himself deliberately, brick by brick, choice by choice, without the weight of family expectation pressing down on every decision. He rose from that rented bed with nothing but skill in his hands and hunger in his heart, and set about becoming Benjamin Franklin. His first priority was simple survival, which meant finding work. He sought out Samuel Keimer, a printer whose shop on High Street was more chaos than business, a jumble of broken equipment and half-finished projects that spoke of ambition without discipline. Keimer was eccentric, brilliant in flashes and absent-minded in everything else, the kind of master who needed help but barely knew how to accept it. He looked at the young man before him, still rumpled from travel, still obviously new to the city, and saw someone desperate enough to work for very little. Benjamin looked at Keimer's struggling operation and saw exactly what he needed: employment that would keep him fed while he learned the city and made himself known. They struck an agreement that satisfied neither completely but served both adequately, and Benjamin Franklin began his Philadelphia life setting type and cleaning presses in a shop that smelled of ink and unrealized potential. He worked hard, harder than Keimer expected, bringing order to the disorder and competence to tasks that had been done sloppily before. But work alone would not build the life he envisioned. Benjamin understood something that many young men did not: reputation was a form of capital, and in a small city like Philadelphia, it could be earned through consistent, visible virtue. He did not merely work hard, he was seen working hard. He did not merely read books, he carried them through the streets where others would notice, marking himself as a young man of learning and ambition. He did not merely live frugally, he made his frugality obvious, pushing a wheelbarrow of paper through town himself rather than hiring help, showing everyone that he was industrious, humble, and serious about his business. These were not deceptions but performances of truth, the deliberate cultivation of a character that was genuine at its core but amplified for effect. He found lodging with the Reed family, the same household where that young woman named Deborah had watched him stumble through town eating his puffy rolls. Now he saw her daily, and something gentle and warm developed between them, a courtship conducted in the careful Quaker manner of the city, all respectful distance and meaningful glances. Deborah's mother approved initially, seeing in Benjamin a hard-working young man with prospects, someone who might provide well for her daughter despite his youth and current poverty. The future seemed to be arranging itself into a pleasant pattern: work, courtship, the steady accumulation of stability and respect. Then Pennsylvania's governor, Sir William Keith, entered Benjamin's life like a character from a fairy tale, offering golden promises that glittered with possibility. Keith had heard of the talented young printer and sought him out at Keimer's shop, speaking words that fell on Benjamin's ears like prophecy. Philadelphia needed a better printing establishment, Keith explained, and this young man had the skills to provide it. If Benjamin would travel to London, purchase the best equipment and type, learn the most advanced methods, Keith himself would provide letters of credit and support, would ensure the business succeeded upon his return. It was an extraordinary offer, the kind of patronage that could leapfrog years of slow progress and establish Benjamin as Philadelphia's premier printer almost immediately. Benjamin was 18 years old, clever but not yet wise, ambitious enough to hear opportunity but too inexperienced to hear the hollow echo beneath Keith's grand words. He accepted with a gratitude that bordered on worship, making plans to sail for London, imagining himself returning with equipment and knowledge that would transform his prospects entirely. Deborah's mother grew concerned. This sudden journey seemed reckless, and marriage should wait until after his return when his situation was secure. Benjamin agreed reluctantly, understanding the practicality but aching with the romance of a promise deferred. He boarded a ship bound for London in November 1724, carrying Keith's assurances and his own boundless hope, sailing toward an education that would cost him dearly but teach him truths no apprenticeship could provide. London was vast and overwhelming, a city that made Philadelphia seem like a village and Boston like a provincial town. Benjamin arrived expecting letters of credit and support, expecting Keith's promises to materialize into practical assistance. He went to the addresses provided, made inquiries, waited for the documents that would allow him to purchase equipment and establish credit with suppliers. Nothing came. He inquired further, more urgently, until finally the truth became unavoidable. Governor Keith was known in London as a man of grand words and empty promises, someone who offered patronage he had no means to provide, who spoke as if his words alone could conjure reality. There would be no letters of credit, no financial backing, no equipment purchased on favorable terms. Benjamin Franklin was stranded in London with barely enough money to survive, his dreams of triumphant return dissolving like morning fog under harsh sunlight. The shock of betrayal could have broken him. Many young men, finding themselves abandoned in a foreign city with empty pockets and emptier promises, would have despaired or grown bitter, would have found the nearest ship home and retreated to whatever safety remained. But Benjamin Franklin discovered something about himself in that moment of profound disappointment. He bent but did not break, adapted rather than surrendered. If London would not be the place where he bought equipment, it would become the place where he refined his craft and tested his resilience. He found work at Palmer's printing house, then at Watts's, two of London's finest establishments where the standards were exacting and the pace relentless. He set type for books that would be read across Europe, learned techniques that provincial American shops had never seen, and absorbed the culture of printing at its highest level. London in the 1720s was a city of contrasts that would have dizzied a less observant visitor. Coffee houses bubbled with philosophical debate while gin shops destroyed lives in steady streams. Theaters presented Shakespeare while public executions drew cheering crowds. Benjamin moved through this world with curious eyes and a careful purse, spending little but observing everything. He lived frugally in lodgings that were barely more than closets, worked long hours at the press, and spent his evenings reading in public libraries or engaging in discussions with other young men who gathered to debate ideas about religion, government, and human nature. He wrote and published a pamphlet on metaphysics that he would later regret, not for its ideas exactly, but for its youthful arrogance, its certainty about questions that deserved humility. Still, the act of writing, of putting his thoughts into public form, of risking criticism to contribute to larger conversations, shaped him in ways the content itself never could. He made friends among the printers and intellectuals, but he also watched those same friends waste their wages on drink and entertainment, living always at the edge of poverty despite skilled work that should have lifted them higher. Benjamin saw the pattern clearly: talent without discipline meant nothing, knowledge without application changed nothing, work without saving led nowhere. He resolved not to follow their path. While others spent evenings in taverns, he spent his in careful economy, putting aside small amounts that accumulated slowly but steadily. While others borrowed against future wages, he kept his debts cleared and his commitments minimal. It was not joyless. He appreciated beauty and culture, attended plays occasionally, bought books when he could justify them, but everything was measured against a future he was building in his mind, a vision of who he intended to become that required resources he did not yet possess. After 18 months in London, an opportunity emerged through a merchant named Thomas Denham who had befriended Benjamin and seen his character clearly. Denham was returning to Philadelphia to open a general store, and he offered Benjamin a position as clerk and bookkeeper, passage paid, future secured in honest work even if it meant stepping away from printing temporarily. It was not the triumphant return Benjamin had once imagined, not the establishment of his own printing house with London equipment, but it was a way home, a way forward, and he accepted with relief and gratitude. The voyage back across the Atlantic in 1726 gave him time to reflect, to take measure of the boy who had left and the young man returning. He wrote a plan for his life, a set of principles he called the art of virtue, rules about how to conduct himself, how to cultivate good habits and eliminate bad ones, how to become methodically the person he aspired to be. Philadelphia welcomed him back not with fanfare but with the quiet recognition of someone returning slightly changed, slightly more substantial than before. He worked for Denham faithfully, learning the merchant's trade, proving himself reliable in the careful management of inventory and accounts. But fate, indifferent to plans, intervened. Denham fell ill with pleurisy, and Benjamin caught the same disease. They both nearly died, fevered and weak while doctors prescribed bleeding and purgatives that probably worsened their conditions more than helped. Denham did not recover. He died, taking with him not just a mentor and friend but also Benjamin's immediate future. The store would close, the employment would end, and Benjamin would need to find his path yet again. He returned to Keimer's print shop, the same chaotic operation he had left years before, but now with London experience that made him more valuable than any other printer in Philadelphia. Keimer recognized this reluctantly, needing Benjamin's skill but resenting his competence. The arrangement was temporary and both men knew it, a placeholder until something better emerged. That something came in the form of a partnership with Hugh Meredith, another of Keimer's workers whose father had money and faith in Benjamin's abilities. They would open their own shop, independent and properly equipped, splitting ownership but with Benjamin managing all operations. It was not quite the business Benjamin had dreamed of. Partnership meant shared profits and shared control, but it was real, achievable, and unmistakably his own. In 1728, at 22 years old, Benjamin Franklin opened the door to his printing house and began the work of building not just a business but a life that would matter. The print shop on Market Street started small, just 2 men and a press and hopes written in careful business plans. But Benjamin brought more than skill to the enterprise, he brought strategy. He understood that printing was not merely craft but communication, not just producing pages but shaping what people read and thought and discussed. He printed whatever work came through the door competently and quickly, building a reputation for reliability that brought more work in return. But he also sought out contracts that would provide steady income, government printing, legal forms, the kinds of unglamorous but necessary work that kept the press running and the bills paid while he pursued more ambitious projects. Within a year, opportunity arrived wearing the unexpected face of competition. Keimer, perhaps sensing that his former employee would soon eclipse him entirely, decided to start a newspaper called the Universal Instructor in All Arts and Sciences, and Pennsylvania Gazette. The title alone betrayed Keimer's weakness. It was unwieldy, pretentious, and utterly lacking in the sharp clarity that newspapers required. Benjamin watched his old master's venture with interest that bordered on calculation. He knew newspapers, understood their power and their pitfalls, and recognized immediately that Keimer's publication was doomed by its own ambitions. It tried to educate when readers wanted information, tried to impress when they wanted connection. So Benjamin began writing anonymous pieces for a competing newspaper, satirical essays that gently mocked Keimer's publication while demonstrating what good writing actually looked like. The pieces were clever without being cruel, funny without being mean-spirited, and they accomplished exactly what Benjamin intended. They made readers notice the difference between competent printing and genuine journalism. Keimer struggled on for months, but his heart was never truly in the newspaper business. When Benjamin and Meredith offered to purchase the Pennsylvania Gazette for a modest sum, Keimer accepted with visible relief, glad to be free of an enterprise that had brought him more stress than profit. Benjamin Franklin now owned a newspaper. At 23, he held in his hands an instrument that could shape opinion, spread information, unite communities, and earn steady income if managed properly. He shortened the title to simply the Pennsylvania Gazette, stripped away the pompous educational pretensions, and filled its pages with news that mattered to Philadelphia residents: ship arrivals and departures, political developments, crime reports, commercial opportunities, and essays that entertained while they informed. He wrote much of the content himself, developing a style that was clear and accessible, occasionally witty, always purposeful. The Gazette became required reading for anyone who wanted to understand what was happening in their city and colony, and as readership grew, so did advertising revenue. The newspaper was not just a platform for ideas, it was an engine of prosperity, pulling Benjamin's fortunes upward with every weekly edition. But prosperity brought its own complications. Hugh Meredith, his partner, was proving less useful than his father's money had been. He drank too much, worked too little, and showed none of Benjamin's driving ambition. The partnership was becoming a burden, and Benjamin needed to find a way to dissolve it without losing the business entirely. Two friends, seeing the situation clearly, offered to loan Benjamin the money to buy out Meredith's share, trusting that Franklin would repay them with the same reliability he showed in all his dealings. The transaction completed quietly in 1730, and suddenly Benjamin was sole owner of both the print shop and the newspaper. He was also deeply in debt to his friends, but debt taken on for ownership felt different than debt from desperation. This was investment in himself, and he would prove worthy of that trust through sheer determination and careful management. That same year, 1730, he married Deborah Red, the girl who had watched him arrive in Philadelphia 7 years earlier. Their courtship had survived his London absence, but it was complicated by her marriage to another man during those years, a potter named John Rogers, who had abandoned her and disappeared, leaving Deborah in legal limbo, not quite married, not quite free. Without clear evidence of Rogers's death, a formal marriage to Benjamin would risk bigamy charges. So they entered into a common-law marriage, as binding in practice as any ceremony but safer from legal complications. Deborah moved into the rooms above the print shop, bringing her practical competence to his ambitious vision. She was not a woman of letters or philosophy, she spelled poorly and preferred action to contemplation, but she managed the shop's accounts with fierce attention, sold books and supplies to customers, and brought to their household a stability that Benjamin's restless intellect needed as counterbalance. Their home above the print shop became both residence and headquarters, a place where business and life intermingled without clear boundaries. Benjamin rose early, worked late, filled every available hour with productive activity. But he also understood that success required more than individual effort, it required community, connection, networks of mutual support and shared purpose. So he gathered friends, other young tradesmen and merchants and professionals, and formed what he called the Junto, a club that met weekly to discuss ideas and help one another improve. They debated philosophical questions about ethics and government, but they also shared practical information about business opportunities and personal challenges. They loaned each other books, recommended each other's services, and created a web of mutual advancement that lifted all members together. The junto discussions revealed a problem that bothered Benjamin deeply. Philadelphia had no public library, no place where a young tradesman with limited means could access books beyond what he could personally afford. The wealthy had private libraries, but knowledge remained locked behind financial barriers that kept too many bright minds in darkness. So Benjamin proposed a subscription library, a joint stock company where members would pool resources to purchase books that all could share. 50 subscribers each contributed 40 shillings initially, then 10 shillings annually, creating a fund large enough to order books from London, histories and scientific treatises, philosophical works and practical manuals, poetry and politics, all shelved together in rooms where members could browse and borrow freely. The Library Company of Philadelphia opened in 1731, and while it was not the first subscription library in America, it became the model that others followed, spreading the radical notion that knowledge should be accessible to anyone willing to seek it. Benjamin watched his library grow and saw his vision multiplying. More books arrived with each shipment, more members joined, more young men whose circumstances had not provided formal education found pathways to learning that could change their lives. This was power different from political authority or economic wealth. This was the power to shape minds, to spread enlightenment, to make his community stronger and wiser with every volume placed on those shelves. And it cost him nothing but the subscription he paid like any other member, though the satisfaction it brought was beyond any monetary measure. Success in business gave Benjamin Franklin something more precious than money, it gave him time. By his early 30s, the print shop ran smoothly enough that he could hire competent workers to handle daily operations. The Pennsylvania Gazette had a steady rhythm of production, and his almanac, Poor Richard's, sold thousands of copies each year, filling colonial homes with wisdom wrapped in humor. He had proven himself as a tradesman, established his reputation as a civic leader, and secured enough income that survival was no longer his primary concern. Now he could turn his restless mind toward questions that had fascinated him since childhood, mysteries hidden in the everyday world, phenomena that others accepted without question but that made Benjamin wonder why and how. He had always been curious about nature's workings, the mechanical principles underlying visible effects. As a boy he had watched ships in Boston Harbor and wondered about hull designs and sail configurations. As a swimmer, and he was an excellent swimmer, having taught himself techniques that were ahead of his time, he had experimented with ways to move more efficiently through water. Now, with resources and leisure to pursue systematic inquiry, he began exploring electricity, a phenomenon that was entertaining parlor audiences across Europe and America but remained deeply mysterious in its fundamental nature. Electricity in the 1740s was a curiosity, something produced by rubbing glass tubes with silk or spinning sulfur spheres against leather. It could make sparks jump between conductors, cause hair to stand on end, make small objects dance and spin with invisible force. Traveling showmen performed electrical demonstrations like magic tricks, delighting audiences with effects they could see but not explain. Benjamin attended one such demonstration in Boston and immediately recognized that beneath the spectacle lay real questions worth investigating. He returned to Philadelphia with electrical equipment purchased from the demonstrator, set up a laboratory in his home, and began conducting experiments with the methodical patience of someone seeking truth rather than entertainment. He discovered that electricity could be stored in what he called a Leyden jar, a glass container that could hold an electrical charge and discharge it suddenly with shocking force, literally shocking, as he and his friends learned through painful experimentation. He noticed that pointed conductors drew electrical charge more effectively than rounded ones, a small observation that would later have enormous practical implications. He developed vocabulary to describe what he was observing: positive and negative charge, electrical battery, conductor and insulator, words that would become standard scientific language but began as Benjamin's attempts to make sense of effects he could measure but not fully explain. He wrote letters describing his findings to Peter Collinson, a fellow scientist in London, and those letters began circulating among Europe's scientific community, earning respect from men who spent their lives in universities while Benjamin conducted research above a print shop. But it was lightning that captured his imagination most powerfully. Everyone knew lightning was dangerous and destructive, fire from the sky that split trees and burned buildings and killed animals and people with terrible randomness. The prevailing assumption was that lightning was an act of God, divine judgment or celestial anger made visible. But Benjamin wondered if lightning might be electrical, the same phenomenon he was producing in miniature in his laboratory, just vastly more powerful. The similarities were striking, both produced light and heat, both made crackling sounds, both traveled through conductors and were stopped by insulators, both killed living things with similar effects. If lightning was indeed electrical, then it was not mysterious or supernatural, it was natural, understandable, and potentially controllable. Testing this hypothesis required bringing lightning down to earth in a way that could be measured and studied. Benjamin designed an experiment that was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its danger. He would fly a kite during a thunderstorm, with a metal key attached to the string near the ground. If lightning was electrical, charge should travel down the wet string and collect on the key, where it could produce sparks just like those from his laboratory equipment. He waited for the right weather, a thunderstorm approaching with sufficient clouds but not yet producing rain that would ground the string prematurely. In June 1752, accompanied by his son William, he stood in a field outside Philadelphia and launched his kite into the darkening sky. The experiment has become legend, retold so many times it has acquired mythical qualities that obscure the actual events. But what happened was both simpler and more profound than myth suggests. Benjamin and William waited as the kite rose into the storm clouds, watching for any sign of electrical charge. At first, nothing. Then Benjamin noticed that loose threads on the string were standing erect, repelling each other as charged objects do. He brought his knuckle near the key and felt the sharp tingle of a spark jumping the gap. Again and again he drew sparks from the key, demonstrating beyond doubt that storm clouds were indeed electrically charged, that lightning was the same phenomenon he could produce with glass tubes and silk, just magnified to awesome scale. He had reached up and touched the power of storms, had proven that heaven's fire followed natural laws that human minds could comprehend. The implications of that single experiment rippled outward like electricity through a conductor. If lightning was electrical, then it could be controlled, diverted, rendered less destructive through simple mechanical means. Benjamin proposed installing pointed metal rods on the tops of buildings, connected by wire to metal stakes driven deep into the ground. Lightning, attracted to the highest point in an area, would strike the rod rather than the structure itself, and the charge would flow harmlessly into the earth rather than exploding through wooden beams and setting fires. It was ingenious in its simplicity, the kind of solution that seems obvious only after someone brilliant enough to see it clearly has explained it to everyone else. He published his findings in a pamphlet titled Experiments and Observations on Electricity, which circulated throughout Europe and was translated into multiple languages. The French Academy of Sciences tested his theories and confirmed them. King Louis XV ordered lightning rods installed on his palace. British scientists, some reluctantly, others enthusiastically, acknowledged that this American tradesman had made genuine contributions to natural philosophy. Benjamin Franklin had entered the ranks of European intellectuals not through aristocratic birth or formal education, but through careful observation, clever experimentation, and clear communication of results. He corresponded with the greatest scientific minds of his age as an equal, discussing theories about heat and light and the nature of matter, offering insights that were taken seriously because he had proven himself worthy of serious consideration. But Benjamin was not content to simply understand nature, he wanted to improve human life through that understanding. The lightning rod was just the beginning. He turned his attention to more mundane but equally important problems. Reading and distance vision both required spectacles, but switching between two pairs was annoying and inefficient. So he designed bifocals, glasses with lenses split horizontally so the top half corrected distance vision while the bottom half allowed reading. He wore them himself and shared the design freely with anyone who asked, refusing to patent the invention because he believed useful improvements should benefit everyone, not enrich individuals through monopoly. Home heating troubled him as well. Traditional fireplaces were beautiful but wasteful, sending most of their heat up the chimney while rooms remained cold and fuel costs drained household budgets. Benjamin designed a cast-iron stove with a more efficient configuration, drawing air in controlled ways to produce more heat from less wood. The Pennsylvania fireplace, later called the Franklin stove, warmed thousands of colonial homes through bitter winters. Again, he refused patents and profits, explaining his philosophy with characteristic clarity: as we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours, and this we should do freely and generously. His scientific curiosity extended to medicine, though he approached it with more caution than other fields. He noticed that people who caught smallpox through variolation, deliberate exposure to mild cases, gained immunity and spread the practice through careful advocacy. He studied lead poisoning among printers who handled type daily, connecting their symptoms to the metal and recommending precautions. He investigated the warming effects of different colored clothing under sunlight, the best methods for swimming and resuscitating drowning victims, the properties of sound and the design of musical instruments. Nothing was too small for his attention if it might yield useful knowledge or practical improvement. He even turned his mind to the ocean itself, that vast body of water he had crossed multiple times between America and Europe. He noticed that ships sailing eastward consistently made faster passage than ships returning westward, and he talked with sailors and ship's captains, gathering observations that others had noticed but not examined systematically. The result was the first published chart of the Gulf Stream, that great current of warm water flowing northward along America's eastern coast before turning toward Europe. Ships that used his chart could shave weeks off their passages by sailing with the current or avoiding it depending on their direction. It was oceanography before the discipline had a name, practical science born from curiosity about patterns in nature. His work on electricity earned him the Royal Society's Copley Medal in 1753, the scientific community's highest honor. Harvard and Yale both awarded him honorary degrees, acknowledging that this man who had never completed formal schooling beyond a year of grammar lessons had educated himself into genuine scholarly achievement. He was elected to the Royal Society and corresponding scientific societies across Europe. Benjamin Franklin the printer had become Benjamin Franklin the natural philosopher, recognized internationally for contributions that advanced human understanding of the physical world. Yet he never took himself too seriously, never let accomplishment inflate into arrogance. He approached science with playfulness alongside rigor, conducting experiments with friends who gathered at his home to witness electrical demonstrations and debate theories over wine and conversation. He admitted mistakes freely, revised conclusions when new evidence demanded it, and encouraged others to test his claims rather than accepting them on authority. "We must not," he wrote, "presume too much on our own judgment, or suppose it to be infallible." This humility, combined with genuine brilliance, made him beloved among the scientific community in ways that pure intellect alone could never achieve. He was brilliant but accessible, accomplished but unpretentious, always willing to explain complex ideas in language that ordinary people could understand. When he wrote about electricity, he avoided technical jargon where possible, using clear descriptions and everyday analogies that made difficult concepts graspable. Science, he believed, should not be locked away in academic language that only scholars could penetrate. It should be shared broadly, discussed openly, used to improve life for everyone rather than enhancing the reputation of the few who happen to study it. While Benjamin pursued knowledge for its own sake, he never forgot that understanding without application was incomplete. Science served humanity best when it moved from laboratory to daily life, when discoveries became tools that ordinary people could use to live better, safer, more comfortable lives. His lightning rod saved buildings from fire, his bifocals allowed aging eyes to see clearly, his stove kept families warm through winter. Each invention was a gift he gave freely to a world that had given him the freedom to think and experiment and create. He also understood that knowledge itself needed infrastructure to flourish. The library he had founded continued growing, but Philadelphia needed more. It needed an institution where young men could gather to learn systematically, where lectures could be delivered and experiments conducted and ideas exchanged in formal settings. So Benjamin and his Junto colleagues proposed an academy that would eventually become the University of Pennsylvania, a school focused not just on classical education but on practical learning that prepared students for useful lives. Mathematics and natural philosophy joined Latin and Greek, commerce and agriculture were studied alongside literature and history. It was education designed for the new world, for a society that valued ability over ancestry and measured worth through contribution rather than inherited title. He helped establish Pennsylvania Hospital, the first in the colonies, recognizing that medical care should be available to all who needed it, not just those who could afford private physicians. He organized Philadelphia's first fire company, the Union Fire Company, where members agreed to assist each other when fire threatened, carrying leather buckets and salvaging furniture and fighting flames together because cooperation meant survival in wooden cities where fire could spread with terrifying speed. He reformed the city's night watch, making streets safer through systematic patrols. He led efforts to pave and light the streets, transforming muddy paths and dark lanes into cleaner, safer thoroughfares where commerce and community could flourish. Every civic improvement reflected his understanding that individual success meant nothing if the community remained backward and struggling. He could have retired into comfortable prosperity, reading his books and conducting his experiments, leaving public affairs to others. Instead, he poured energy into making Philadelphia better, serving on city councils and colonial assemblies, chairing committees, drafting proposals, using his reputation and rhetorical skills to convince others that progress required collective action and shared investment. He never sought glory from these efforts. Many of his civic proposals were presented anonymously or attributed to groups rather than individuals, because he understood that ideas moved forward more easily when people thought they belonged to everyone rather than one man's vision. His scientific work continued through these busy years of civic engagement. He studied the nature of heat, proposing theories about how it moved through different materials. He investigated the properties of oil on water, noticing how even tiny amounts spread across large surfaces, creating calm in turbulent waves, observations that would contribute to understanding molecular forces long after his death. He corresponded with European scientists about geology and weather patterns, fossils and earthquakes, the formation of mountains and the causes of storms. His letters were miniature essays, filled with keen observations and logical reasoning, always questioning assumptions and seeking better explanations for phenomena others accepted without investigation. But perhaps his greatest contribution to science was not any single discovery or invention. It was his demonstration that genius could flourish outside traditional institutions, that curiosity and careful observation mattered more than formal credentials, that practical men pursuing questions in spare hours could advance human knowledge as surely as full-time scholars working in universities. He proved that science was not the exclusive domain of European aristocrats and clergy, but could thrive in a young democracy among people who made their living with their hands as much as their minds. He became living proof that the new world could produce not just commerce and raw materials but ideas and discoveries that enriched all humanity. As the 1750s progressed, Benjamin's reputation extended far beyond Pennsylvania. His almanac was read throughout the colonies, his newspaper influenced opinion in ways that made politicians nervous, his scientific work had earned international recognition, and his civic improvements had made Philadelphia the most progressive city in British America. He was 50 years old, successful beyond anything that runaway Apprentice could have imagined, yet he showed no signs of slowing down or settling into comfortable retirement. The world kept presenting new problems to solve, new questions to investigate, new opportunities to be useful, and Benjamin Franklin kept accepting those challenges with the same curiosity and energy that had driven him since childhood. He had proven himself as a printer, a writer, a scientist, an inventor, and a civic leader. Each role had built upon the others, each success had opened doors to new possibilities, each achievement had been shared generously rather than hoarded selfishly. He had built businesses but also libraries, made money but also made his community better, earned honors but never forgot his humble origins. He was, in every sense, a self-made man, not because he had lifted himself through individual effort alone, but because he had consciously, deliberately shaped his character and contributions to match his highest aspirations. But the greatest chapters of his life still lay ahead, though he could not have known it as he sat in his comfortable Philadelphia home, surrounded by books and electrical equipment and the comfortable accumulation of a well-lived life. History was about to call him away from laboratories and libraries, away from the pleasant rhythms of inquiry and civic service, toward challenges that would test not his scientific brilliance but his diplomatic skill, not his capacity for invention but his commitment to principles larger than personal comfort. The scientist and civic leader was about to become a revolutionary, and the transformation would demand everything he had learned through 50 years of building himself into someone worthy of the moment that was coming. The transformation came gradually, like dawn spreading across the horizon rather than lightning splitting the sky. Benjamin Franklin had lived most of his life avoiding politics beyond local civic matters, content to improve his community through libraries and fire companies rather than wrestling with the larger questions of colonial governance and imperial relations. But the 1750s brought tensions that could not be ignored, conflicts between the colonies and London that grew sharper with each passing year, each new tax, each assertion of parliamentary authority over people who felt increasingly American rather than British. Benjamin watched these tensions build with the same careful observation he brought to scientific phenomena, noting patterns, measuring forces, trying to understand where the pressures might lead. In 1757, the Pennsylvania Assembly sent him to London as their representative, tasked with resolving disputes between the colony and its proprietors, the Penn family, who still claimed ownership of Pennsylvania's lands and governed through appointed representatives who answered to their interests rather than the people's needs. Benjamin crossed the Atlantic again, returning to the city where he had once worked as a journeyman printer, but now arriving as a colonial agent, a man of reputation and influence sent to negotiate with power on behalf of people thousands of miles away. He settled into lodgings on Craven Street, near the Thames, and began the slow work of navigating British politics, meeting with officials, drafting petitions, explaining colonial perspectives to people who had never seen America and could barely imagine it. He remained in London for 5 years on that first mission, then returned briefly to Philadelphia before being sent back for what would become an even longer stay. In total, he spent nearly 2 decades in England during the crucial years leading to revolution, watching the relationship between colonies and crown deteriorate like a marriage dying slowly, each side growing more entrenched in positions that made reconciliation increasingly impossible. Benjamin tried desperately to bridge that widening gap, to explain each side to the other, to find compromises that might preserve the empire while respecting colonial rights and dignity. He loved England, its culture and learning, its theaters and coffee houses, the intellectual vibrancy of a society that had produced Shakespeare and Newton. He wanted to remain British, wanted his fellow colonists to remain British, but only if Britain would treat them as equals rather than subjects to be exploited. The Stamp Act of 1765 crystallized everything that was going wrong. Parliament imposed taxes on colonial newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, on paper itself, the very material of Benjamin's trade and livelihood. Worse than the tax was the principle behind it. Parliament claimed authority to tax colonists who had no representation in that body, who could not vote for or against the men making laws that affected their lives and livelihoods. Benjamin initially thought the act might be endured, might be the price of remaining within the empire's protection. But colonial reaction was swift and fierce, more intense than he had anticipated. Mobs burned tax collectors in effigy, merchants organized boycotts, assemblies drafted protests, and the stamp tax became impossible to enforce because entire populations refused to comply. Benjamin found himself called before Parliament in 1766 to answer questions about colonial attitudes and intentions. He stood in that chamber where imperial power resided and spoke for hours, answering inquiry after inquiry with calm precision and devastating clarity. He explained that colonists were loyal but not servile, that they would accept reasonable governance but not exploitation, that forced taxation without representation violated principles British subjects held sacred. His testimony helped convince Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, a victory that made him briefly heroic in colonial eyes while making him suspect to British authorities who saw him as dangerously sympathetic to colonial rebelliousness. The victory proved temporary. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act but immediately passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. New taxes followed, on tea, on glass, on paint and paper, each one probing colonial resistance, testing how much could be extracted before rebellion became preferable to submission. Benjamin continued his diplomatic work, writing essays for British newspapers explaining colonial perspectives, meeting privately with officials to propose compromises, drafting plans for imperial reform that would give colonists meaningful representation while maintaining the empire's unity. He proposed a Grand Council where colonial and British representatives would jointly govern American affairs, a federation that might preserve connection while respecting autonomy. But London was not interested in power sharing or federation. The ministers and members of parliament saw the colonies as possessions to be managed, sources of revenue and raw materials that existed for Britain's benefit. They could not imagine Americans as equals deserving partnership in governance. Every proposal Benjamin made for compromise and reform was dismissed or ignored. Every warning he offered about colonial determination was treated as exaggeration or disloyalty. He watched men he respected make decisions driven by contempt for colonials, by assumptions of superiority that made real understanding impossible. Slowly, painfully, Benjamin's hope for reconciliation eroded like cliffs worn down by relentless waves. The breaking point came in 1774, though its seeds had been planted years earlier. Benjamin had obtained private letters written by Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, letters that revealed Hutchinson had been urging British authorities to take harder lines against colonial assemblies, to restrict liberties, to govern with a firmer hand. Benjamin sent these letters to trusted correspondents in Boston, believing that if colonists understood their own governor was working against their interests, they might focus anger on Hutchinson rather than on Britain generally, might see the problem as particular men rather than systemic tyranny. It was a miscalculation born from his desperate desire to preserve the empire by redirecting colonial rage toward acceptable targets. Instead, the letters ignited fury. Massachusetts demanded Hutchinson's removal, and British authorities demanded to know who had leaked private correspondence. Benjamin initially remained silent, watching as others were accused, but he could not let innocent men suffer for his actions. He published a statement taking full responsibility, and suddenly Benjamin Franklin, respected scientist, honored diplomat, loyal subject who had spent decades trying to bridge British and American interests, was summoned before the Privy Council to answer for his betrayal of confidentiality and trust. The hearing took place in the cockpit, an octagonal room where cockfights had once entertained royalty and now served for official proceedings. Benjamin stood silent while the Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn, delivered a verbal assault that lasted over an hour. Wedderburn called him a thief who had stolen private letters, a man without honor or principle, someone who had betrayed the trust placed in him as a colonial agent. The assembled officials and observers laughed at Wedderburn's barbs, enjoying the humiliation of this aging American who had pretended to be their equal. Benjamin stood throughout in his fine suit of figured blue velvet, his face composed, revealing nothing while Wedderburn's words cut into him like surgical instruments. He said nothing in his own defense. He simply stood there and absorbed the public shaming, understanding in that moment that reconciliation was impossible, that the men who governed Britain held colonials in such contempt that no amount of reason or diplomacy could bridge the gulf between them. He was stripped of his position as Deputy Postmaster General for North America, a post he had held for years with distinction. His reputation in London circles collapsed overnight, doors that had been open closed firmly, friends became distant, and the respect he had carefully built through decades of scientific work and diplomatic service evaporated in one afternoon of official cruelty. He remained in London for another year, going through diplomatic motions while knowing they were futile, making final attempts at compromise while understanding that both sides had moved beyond the point where compromise was possible. His son William, now Royal Governor of New Jersey, remained loyal to the crown, creating a family wound that would never truly heal. Benjamin had raised William, supported his career, loved him as fathers love sons, yet they now stood on opposite sides of a divide that made love insufficient to bridge political principle. It was a private grief carried through public crisis, a reminder that revolution tears families apart as surely as it tears apart empires. In March 1775, Benjamin finally sailed for Philadelphia, leaving England behind after nearly 2 decades of trying to preserve a relationship that no longer wanted preserving. He was 69 years old, exhausted from failed diplomacy, stripped of honors he had earned, returning to a homeland on the brink of war. The voyage took 6 weeks, and somewhere in the middle of that gray Atlantic crossing, news reached America that British soldiers and Massachusetts militia had exchanged fire at Lexington and Concord. Revolution had begun without him, while he floated between worlds, belonging fully to neither London nor Philadelphia anymore, transformed by failure from mediator into revolutionary despite everything he had hoped and worked to prevent. He arrived in Philadelphia on May 5, 1775, and the next day was elected to the Continental Congress. There was no time for rest, no period of adjustment or recovery. The colonies needed every capable man, and Benjamin Franklin, stripped of illusions but not of capacity, set aside his weariness and went to work building a nation from the ruins of his diplomatic hopes. He served on committees, drafted documents, used his knowledge of British politics to help his fellow delegates understand what they were truly facing. He was by far the oldest man in Congress, old enough to be grandfather to many serving alongside him, yet his mind remained sharp and his commitment absolute. He helped draft the Declaration of Independence, though Thomas Jefferson did most of the writing. When Jefferson showed him drafts, Benjamin suggested small changes that made the language stronger, the arguments clearer. He sat in that sweltering Philadelphia summer of 1776, listening to debates about whether to declare independence or continue seeking reconciliation, and he knew from bitter experience that reconciliation was fantasy. When the vote came, he signed his name in the flowing script he had perfected decades earlier as a young printer, knowing that signature marked him as a traitor in British eyes, knowing that if revolution failed he would likely hang. "We must all hang together," he reportedly quipped, "or assuredly we shall all hang separately." Even in the gravest moments, he found room for humor that eased tension and reminded everyone that fear should not paralyze action. But signing the Declaration was the easy part. Winning the war it declared would require more than brave words on parchment, it would require money, weapons, supplies, and most critically, international support. A ragtag collection of colonies could not defeat the British Empire alone. They needed allies, and the only power capable of matching Britain was France, still nursing wounds from defeats in the 7 Years' War, still looking for opportunities to weaken their ancient rival. Congress needed someone to go to Paris, to convince the French court to support American independence with money and arms and eventually military force. They needed someone with diplomatic experience, international reputation, knowledge of European politics, and enough charm to navigate the intricacies of French court life. They needed Benjamin Franklin. In October 1776, at 70 years old, with winter approaching and British warships patrolling the Atlantic, Benjamin Franklin prepared to cross the ocean one final time. His health was declining, he suffered from gout and kidney stones that made every movement painful, and the voyage itself was dangerous. British ships were capturing American vessels regularly, and if they caught Benjamin Franklin, the most famous American revolutionary after George Washington, his fate would be grim. Friends urged him not to go, argued that someone younger and healthier should take the risk. But Benjamin understood that France needed to see American commitment embodied in someone whose reputation preceded him, whose scientific achievements had earned European respect, whose age itself demonstrated that this revolution was serious enough that even grandfathers would risk everything for it. He brought his 2 young grandsons with him, Temple and Benjamin back, boys who would receive education and opportunity in France while keeping their grandfather company in exile. The crossing took a month through rough winter seas, and Benjamin spent much of it confined to his cabin, sick and uncomfortable, wondering if he would survive to reach France or if this cold Atlantic would be his grave. But the ship evaded British patrols, and in early December 1776, Benjamin Franklin stepped onto French soil at Orly, on the Brittany coast. Word spread quickly through France. The famous scientist, the man who had tamed lightning, the American philosopher had come to plead for French support. It was the diplomatic event of the season, and Paris was eager to receive him. He arrived in the capital just before Christmas, and everything about his appearance was calculated to maximum effect, though it appeared effortlessly natural. While French aristocrats wore elaborate wigs and silk coats heavy with embroidery, Benjamin appeared in plain brown clothes and a fur cap, the very image of frontier simplicity and rustic wisdom. The contrast was perfect. Here was American virtue in the flesh, uncorrupted by European decadence, natural philosophy embodied in natural dress. The French court, drowning in its own artificiality, fell in love with him immediately. He became the toast of Paris salons, where philosophers and nobles gathered to debate ideas and display wit. Women found him charming, men found him fascinating, and everyone wanted to meet the American sage who seemed to step from Rousseau's writings about noble simplicity. But beneath the performance, and it was a performance, carefully calibrated, lay serious diplomatic work. Benjamin needed to convince the French government to commit money, weapons, and eventually troops to support American independence. This was delicate negotiation. France was interested in weakening Britain, but committing to American rebels risked provoking war with Britain before France was ready. Benjamin had to demonstrate that American forces could actually win, that supporting the revolution was investment rather than charity, that French assistance would tip the balance toward victory rather than simply prolonging defeat. He met with Foreign Minister Vergennes repeatedly, pressing for support while understanding that French caution was rational given the risks involved. He secured initial loans and shipments of weapons, crucial supplies that kept Washington's army functioning through desperate winters. But he wanted more. He wanted open alliance, formal recognition of American independence, military support that would force Britain to fight on multiple fronts. The breakthrough came in October 1777, when news reached Paris that American forces had won a decisive victory at Saratoga, capturing an entire British army under General Burgoyne. Suddenly American victory seemed possible rather than merely aspirational. Benjamin used this moment brilliantly, letting it be known that British agents were approaching him with peace offers, suggesting that America might reconcile with Britain if French support was not forthcoming. The hint of losing their opportunity pushed French decision-makers past their caution. In February 1778, France and America signed formal treaties of alliance and commerce. France recognized American independence, committed to military support, and pledged to continue fighting until Britain acknowledged American sovereignty. It was the diplomatic victory that made military victory possible, and Benjamin Franklin had achieved it through a combination of reputation, charm, strategic patience, and carefully timed pressure. He had transformed himself from failed mediator trying to preserve the British Empire into successful diplomat helping to destroy it, and he had done so without abandoning the principles of reason and civility that had always guided him. He remained in France for the rest of the war and beyond, serving as America's minister to the French court, managing the complex relationship between revolutionary America and monarchical France. He lived in Passy, a village just outside Paris, in a comfortable house provided by a generous host, and his home became an unofficial American embassy where French supporters and American visitors gathered. He dined with philosophers, corresponded with scientists, continued his experiments when health permitted, and somehow maintained the image of simplicity while living among European luxury. It was a balancing act that required constant attention. He needed to seem American enough to embody revolutionary virtue but sophisticated enough to function in French society, humble enough to be authentic but impressive enough to command respect. The years in France took their toll. He missed Philadelphia, missed the comfortable rhythms of home, missed being surrounded by English speakers and familiar customs. His health continued declining, the gout worsened, the kidney stones caused agonizing pain, and old age settled into his bones with increasing weight. Yet he persisted, understanding that his presence in France mattered, that his reputation kept French support strong, that leaving before the job was finished would betray everything the revolution stood for. He negotiated loans when American finances collapsed, smoothed diplomatic tensions when cultural misunderstandings threatened the alliance, and served as the face of America to a continent watching with curiosity and calculation. And through it all, he carried the private pain of family division. His son William remained loyal to Britain, remained estranged, remained lost to him in ways that made Benjamin's public triumph feel incomplete. Revolution had cost him his son, and no diplomatic success could heal that wound. He wrote letters that went unanswered, made overtures that were rebuffed, and eventually accepted that some divisions cut too deep for reconciliation. It was a grief he carried quietly, never allowing personal sorrow to interfere with public duty, but it shadowed his years in France like a ghost at every celebration. Victory, when it finally came, arrived not with thunder but with signatures on paper, the same way so many momentous things in Benjamin Franklin's life had materialized, through words carefully arranged, through negotiation and compromise, through the patient work of turning ideas into agreements that would outlast the men who made them. In 1781, news reached Paris that American and French forces had trapped the British army at Yorktown, that Cornwallis had surrendered, that the war was effectively over though peace negotiations would take years. Benjamin felt relief more than triumph, exhaustion more than celebration. He was 75 years old, had spent 5 years in France pleading for support, watching young men die in a war he had tried desperately to prevent through diplomacy and had then worked tirelessly to win when prevention failed. The peace negotiations began in Paris in 1782, and Benjamin was joined by John Adams and John Jay, fellow commissioners charged with securing the best possible terms for American independence. The three men were different in temperament and approach. Adams was prickly and suspicious, Jay was cautious and legalistic, while Benjamin preferred charm and flexibility, but they shared commitment to securing American interests. They were instructed by Congress to coordinate closely with France, to let French diplomats guide the negotiations since France had been America's crucial ally. But the Americans quickly realized that French interests did not always align with American interests, that Vergennes was willing to compromise American territorial claims if it meant weakening Britain while preserving French influence. So the American commissioners made a controversial decision: they would negotiate directly with British representatives, independently of their French allies, securing the best deal they could before presenting it to Vergennes as accomplished fact. It was diplomatically risky, potentially offensive to France, but Benjamin and his colleagues judged it necessary to protect American interests from being sacrificed to French strategic calculations. They met with British negotiators in secret sessions, hammering out terms that recognized American independence, established borders extending to the Mississippi River, granted fishing rights off Newfoundland, and provided for the treatment of loyalists who had remained faithful to the crown. Benjamin's relationship with Adams was often tense. Adams distrusted Benjamin's charm and flexibility, saw it as lack of principle rather than tactical sophistication, resented Benjamin's popularity in France and his easy relationships with French officials. But they worked together effectively enough, their disagreements over method never undermining their agreement on goals. When they finally presented the preliminary peace treaty to Vergennes, the French minister was indeed displeased at being circumvented, at discovering that his American allies had negotiated without his knowledge. But the terms were favorable enough, Britain was ready to accept them, and prolonging negotiations would serve no one's interests. Vergennes accepted the situation with diplomatic grace, and the Treaty of Paris was signed in September 1783, formally ending the war and recognizing the United States of America as a sovereign nation. Benjamin had helped birth that nation through diplomacy as surely as soldiers had through battle. His work in France, securing loans, maintaining the alliance, negotiating the peace, was as essential to American independence as any military campaign. But he was ready to go home. He had left America in 1776 expecting to return within a year or two. Now it was 1785, nearly 9 years later, and he was approaching 80 years old, his health fragile, his energy depleted by decades of public service. He petitioned Congress for permission to return, promising he would serve in whatever capacity they needed once home but pleading to be allowed to end his exile in France. Congress granted his request, and in July 1785, Benjamin Franklin began his final journey home. The French court showered him with honors at his departure. Marie Antoinette gave him a miniature portrait of herself set in diamonds, learned societies held farewell dinners, friends gathered to bid goodbye to the American sage who had lived among them for nearly a decade. He traveled to the coast in a special litter carried by Spanish mules, too infirm to manage a carriage over rough roads, too determined to reach home to let physical discomfort stop him. The voyage across the Atlantic took 7 weeks, and he spent much of it in his cabin, writing scientific papers about ocean temperatures and maritime observations, his mind still curious and active even as his body failed. Philadelphia welcomed him with celebrations that rivaled anything Paris had offered. Bells rang, cannons fired salutes, crowds gathered to cheer as his ship docked. He was carried through the streets in a sedan chair, too weak to walk far, too beloved to arrive unnoticed. He settled back into his home on Market Street, surrounded by family, his daughter Sarah and her children, his grandchildren who had grown in his absence, and tried to find rest after decades of constant motion and public service. He was 80 years old, had earned the right to retire into comfortable obscurity, to spend his remaining days with books and experiments and the peaceful rhythms of private life. But America was not finished needing Benjamin Franklin. The nation he had helped create was discovering that independence was easier to declare than to organize, that 13 separate states with different interests and competing ambitions could barely function as a unified country. The Articles of Confederation, written during the war to provide minimal national government, were proving inadequate for the practical work of governance. Congress could not raise revenue reliably, could not regulate commerce between states, could not enforce treaties or maintain diplomatic credibility. The states were drifting apart, pursuing separate interests, and there was real danger that the United States would fragment into regional confederations or even return to some form of British control simply because chaos and weakness were unsustainable. A convention was called to meet in Philadelphia in May 1787, ostensibly to revise the Articles of Confederation but really to create something entirely new, a constitution that would establish genuine national government while preserving state sovereignty where appropriate. Pennsylvania sent delegates, and among them was Benjamin Franklin, elected unanimously despite his age and declining health. He accepted the duty without hesitation, understanding that this might be the last great work of his life, the final chance to shape the nation he had helped bring into existence. On the convention's opening day, he was carried into the Pennsylvania State House, the same building where independence had been declared 11 years earlier, in a sedan chair borne by prisoners from the city jail, his body too frail to walk but his mind still sharp enough to contribute to the most important political discussion in American history. The convention met through a sweltering Philadelphia summer, windows closed despite the heat to ensure secrecy, delegates debating fundamental questions about power and representation, about how to balance large states against small, about whether slaves would be counted for representation, about how much authority to grant the national government versus the states. Arguments grew heated, tempers flared, and multiple times the convention seemed ready to collapse into irreconcilable factions that would return home having accomplished nothing. Benjamin served as Pennsylvania's delegation leader, and though he spoke infrequently, his voice was weak and he often had others read his remarks aloud, his presence itself was stabilizing, a reminder that the generation who had risked everything for independence was watching to see if their successors could build something lasting from that sacrifice. The central dispute was representation in Congress. Large states wanted representation based on population, more people meant more votes, which seemed obviously fair to them. Small states insisted on equal representation regardless of size, fearing that population-based systems would reduce them to irrelevance, allowing large states to dominate national politics indefinitely. The debate went in circles for weeks, each side presenting logical arguments that were completely incompatible with each other, until compromise began to seem impossible and dissolution began to seem inevitable. Benjamin watched this deadlock with growing concern, understanding that failure here would mean the convention's collapse and possibly the nation's disintegration. He proposed prayer, suggesting that if human wisdom was insufficient, they should seek divine guidance. His motion was politely ignored, there was no money to pay a chaplain, and some delegates suspected Franklin was being satirical given his well-known skepticism about organized religion. But the suggestion itself had effect, reminding everyone that what they were attempting was difficult enough that humility might be more appropriate than certainty. Shortly after, Roger Sherman proposed what became known as the Great Compromise, a two-house legislature with the House of Representatives based on population and the Senate providing equal representation for all states. It was awkward and inelegant, satisfying no one's theoretical preferences, but it broke the deadlock by giving each side something it needed. Benjamin supported the compromise enthusiastically, not because it was perfect but because it was achievable, because continuing the argument would destroy any chance of creating effective national government. He had learned through long experience that perfection was the enemy of good, that insisting on ideal solutions meant accepting no solution at all. "I confess," he said in one of his rare speeches to the full convention, "that there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve, but I am not sure I shall never approve them." He had lived long enough, seen enough, changed his mind enough times to know that certainty about complex political arrangements was usually misplaced. What mattered was creating a framework that could function, that could be improved over time, that was better than the chaos of having no effective national government. Other compromises followed, each one imperfect, each one necessary. Slavery was not abolished but the slave trade could be ended after 20 years, a moral failure that would haunt the nation but a political necessity to keep southern states in the Union. The president would be elected not directly by the people but through an electoral college, an odd mechanism that reflected distrust of popular democracy but provided a system that all sides could accept. The judiciary's powers were outlined but left vague in critical areas, trusting that practice would clarify what theory could not specify precisely. Through all these debates and compromises, Benjamin remained present, suffering through the summer heat despite his age and infirmity, offering suggestions when they might help, staying silent when speech would only complicate. His very presence elevated the proceedings, reminding delegates that they were attempting something historically significant, that future generations would judge whether they had wisdom enough to move past factional interests toward common good. On the final day of the convention, September 17, 1787, the Constitution was ready for signing. Not all delegates were satisfied, some refused to sign, believing the document granted too much power to the national government. Others signed reluctantly, preferring something different but understanding that this was the best agreement achievable. Benjamin rose to speak one final time, his remarks read aloud by James Wilson because his voice could not carry through the chamber. He acknowledged that he did not approve of all parts of the Constitution before them. But he had lived long enough to know that he was not infallible, that his doubts might be wrong, that the document's weaknesses might prove less significant than its strengths. I consent, sir, to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best. It was vintage Franklin, practical, humble, recognizing that politics required accepting adequate solutions rather than holding out for perfect ones that would never arrive. He urged every delegate present to doubt a little of his own infallibility, and join in signing, to present a united front to the nation awaiting the convention's results. It was a plea for humility in the face of complexity, for solidarity despite disagreement, for understanding that the alternative to this imperfect constitution was not some better constitution but likely no effective national government at all. One by one, the delegates came forward to sign. Benjamin watched them, the youngest delegate young enough to be his great-grandson, the oldest, himself, having lived through more history than anyone else in that room, having seen the colonies as British provinces, having watched revolution transform them into independent states, now witnessing their tentative union into something that might become a nation if this constitution held. When Benjamin's turn came, he was helped to the table where the document lay waiting. His hand, which had signed the Declaration of Independence 11 years earlier in this same building, which had signed the Treaty of Paris 4 years earlier in France, which had signed countless other documents through 7 decades of public life, now added his name to the Constitution of the United States. The signature was shaky, age and illness had stolen the steady hand that once set type with perfect precision, but it was clear enough, legible enough, final enough. Benjamin Franklin, at 81 years old, had signed the last great document of his public life. As delegates filed out after the signing, someone asked Benjamin what they had created, a monarchy or a republic. His answer was characteristically cautious and prophetic, a republic, if you can keep it. He knew that constitutions were only paper, that their survival depended on each generation choosing to honor them, that no arrangement of words could prevent determined people from destroying what wiser predecessors had built. The Constitution created possibilities, not guarantees. It provided tools for governance, not certainty of good governance. Its success would depend entirely on whether Americans proved capable of the civic virtue, political wisdom, and institutional commitment that republics required to survive. Benjamin served briefly as President of Pennsylvania, a position analogous to governor, providing elder leadership during the state's transition under the new Constitution. But his health was failing rapidly now. The gout that had plagued him for decades grew more severe, confining him to bed for long periods. The kidney stones caused pain that opium could barely dull. His body was simply wearing out after 80-plus years of constant use, of crossing oceans and walking streets, of setting type and conducting experiments, of enduring carriages over rough roads and diplomatic negotiations that lasted deep into European nights. He spent his final years mostly at home, surrounded by family, receiving visitors when he felt strong enough, working on his autobiography when pain permitted, trying to shape the story of his life before that life concluded. He wrote letters to old friends, tying up loose ends, saying gentle goodbyes wrapped in practical observations about politics and science. To his sister Jane, he wrote with the warm familiarity of lifelong sibling affection. To George Washington, now president under the Constitution both had helped create, he wrote with respect and hope for the new government. To scientific correspondents across Europe, he sent final observations and theories, his curiosity about the natural world persisting even as his ability to investigate it diminished. He freed his slaves in his will and wrote publicly against the institution of slavery, acknowledging what the Constitution had failed to address, calling on future generations to correct what his generation had compromised on for the sake of union. He remained mentally sharp almost to the end, his wit intact, his interest in the world undiminished even when his body could no longer carry him into that world. Visitors found him propped in bed with books nearby, ready to discuss politics or science or philosophy despite obvious physical suffering. He never complained about the pain, never indulged in self-pity about age's indignities, maintained the same practical acceptance of reality that had guided him through every other phase of his life. Death was coming, that was simply a fact, like electricity flowing through a conductor or ships catching the Gulf Stream. Fighting facts was pointless, accepting them with grace was the mark of reason and maturity. In April 1790, Benjamin Franklin's condition worsened significantly. A lung abscess that had been developing for months finally burst, providing brief relief before his body began the final process of shutting down. His daughter Sarah and his grandchildren gathered around his bed, along with a few close friends who had been summoned. He was lucid in his final hours, aware of what was happening, clear-eyed about the approaching end. On April 17, 1790, at 84 years old, Benjamin Franklin died quietly in his bed on Market Street in Philadelphia, the city that had welcomed a runaway apprentice 67 years earlier and watched him transform himself into someone history would never forget. The funeral 4 days later drew 20,000 mourners, nearly the entire population of Philadelphia turning out to honor the printer who became a founding father. Congress wore mourning clothes for a month. The French National Assembly declared 3 days of official mourning, recognizing that Franklin had belonged not just to America but to the Enlightenment, to the broader project of human reason and progress. Eulogies poured in from across America and Europe, celebrating his scientific discoveries, his diplomatic achievements, his civic contributions, his literary wit, his practical wisdom, all the varied facets of a life that had touched so many aspects of human endeavor. But perhaps Benjamin Franklin would have appreciated most the simpler tributes from ordinary people, the printers and tradesmen and shopkeepers who saw in him proof that humble origins did not dictate limited futures, that curiosity and hard work could carry a person as far as talent and ambition could reach. He had never forgotten his beginnings, never pretended to be something other than a tradesman who had educated himself and worked hard. His epitaph, which he wrote himself decades earlier, reflected that identity with characteristic humor and humility. It described him as, the body of Benjamin Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not be lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more, in a new and more elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author. The legacy Benjamin Franklin left behind was not contained in monuments or grand estates. He died comfortably but not wealthy, having given away much of what he earned and refused to profit from his inventions. His legacy lived instead in the institutions he founded that continued serving Philadelphia and the nation, the library that still lent books to anyone willing to read them, the hospital that still treated the sick regardless of their ability to pay, the fire company whose model of cooperative protection had spread to cities across America, the university that still educated young people in both classical learning and practical skills. These were monuments more lasting than bronze or marble, living institutions that touched new lives with each passing generation. His legacy lived in the Constitution he had helped shape, that imperfect but functional framework that somehow held together 13 fractious states and would eventually grow to embrace a continental nation. The document had flaws he recognized, slavery most egregiously, but it also had flexibility, capacity for amendment, ability to grow and adapt as the nation changed. It was a living thing rather than a fossil, and that was appropriate for something Benjamin Franklin had touched, because he had always believed in adaptation, in learning from experience, in revising conclusions when evidence demanded it. A republic, if you can keep it, he had warned, and generations of Americans would struggle with that challenge, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, but always having his words as reminder that democracy was work, not inheritance. His legacy lived in the scientific method he had exemplified, careful observation followed by creative hypothesis followed by rigorous testing followed by willingness to revise based on results. He had shown that science was not mysterious knowledge reserved for university scholars but systematic curiosity available to anyone willing to look carefully at the world and think clearly about what they saw. His electrical experiments opened doors through which others walked into deeper understanding of fundamental forces. His inventions, lightning rod, bifocals, Franklin stove, improved daily life for millions who never knew his name. His approach to inquiry, blending practical goals with theoretical curiosity, became a model for American science, less concerned with pure theory than European traditions but more focused on making knowledge useful, improving human welfare through applied understanding. His legacy lived in the idea of the self-made man, though that phrase would not become common until decades after his death. He proved through his own life that birth did not determine destiny in America, that the soapmaker's son could become a founder of nations, that running away from abusive apprenticeship could lead not to ruin but to remarkable achievement. He was not self-made in the sense of succeeding alone, he benefited from friends and collaborators, from institutions and opportunities that his own efforts created but that also created him. But he was self-made in the sense that he consciously, deliberately shaped his character and abilities, that he chose who to become rather than accepting the identity others tried to assign him. His legacy lived in his writing, which continued being read long after his death. Poor Richard's proverbs became so embedded in American language that people quoted them without knowing their source. A penny saved is a penny earned. Fish and visitors stink after 3 days. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. These were not profound philosophy but practical wisdom, the kind of advice that helped ordinary people navigate life's challenges with a bit more success and a bit more humor. His autobiography became one of the most influential books in American literature, read by generations of young people who saw in his story a template for their own ambitions, who learned from his mistakes and his triumphs, who understood that life was a project of continuous self-improvement rather than fixed destiny. His legacy lived in the republic of letters he had helped create, that international community of thinkers and scientists who corresponded across borders, sharing discoveries and debating ideas, building collective knowledge that belonged to humanity rather than individual nations or institutions. He had corresponded with the greatest minds of his age as an equal, and in doing so had demonstrated that intellectual achievement respected merit rather than credentials, that good ideas could come from anywhere, that the conversation about how to understand nature and improve society should be as open and democratic as the political systems he helped create. But perhaps his deepest legacy was something harder to measure, a certain spirit, a particular way of approaching the world that blended curiosity with practicality, ambition with humility, principle with flexibility. Benjamin Franklin was never an ideologue or a zealot. He did not believe he possessed absolute truth or that any single system could solve all problems. He believed in trying things, seeing what worked, keeping what succeeded and discarding what failed, revising theories based on evidence, compromising when necessary but holding firm on essentials. He believed people were capable of reason but also prone to passion, that institutions needed to account for human nature as it actually was rather than as idealists wished it to be. This pragmatic idealism, if such a phrase captures it, became a distinctly American approach to problems, less concerned with theoretical perfection than European traditions, more focused on practical results, willing to embrace contradictions and compromises if they moved things forward. It was not always admirable, it could excuse moral failures like slavery's continuation, could prioritize expedience over principle, but it was also the mindset that allowed a diverse, sprawling nation to function despite profound disagreements, that made a more perfect union a goal to approach rather than a state to achieve and then preserve unchanged. The world Benjamin Franklin left behind in 1790 was unrecognizable from the world he entered in 1706. He had been born in a collection of British colonies, provincial outposts barely imagining independence. He died in a sovereign nation with its own constitution and government, stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, full of possibilities and challenges that no one could predict. He had helped make that transformation happen through printing and diplomacy, through science and civic leadership, through the quiet accumulation of useful work done day after day across 8 decades of remarkably productive life. And now, as the story comes to rest, as we reach the end of this journey through one man's extraordinary path from printer's apprentice to founding father, there is something worth carrying forward into whatever dreams await. Benjamin Franklin's life teaches that curiosity matters, that kindness costs nothing but brings returns that compound across years, that communities strengthen when individuals contribute rather than merely consume, that failure is temporary if learning persists, that humor helps navigate even the gravest challenges, and that ordinary people who work hard and think clearly and treat others decently can accomplish things that seem impossible until someone proves otherwise by doing them. He would not want to be remembered as a saint. He was too aware of his own flaws, too honest about his mistakes, too skeptical of hero worship to accept such elevation. He was simply a man who paid attention to the world, who worked at becoming better than he started, who used his talents to serve purposes larger than personal profit, and who trusted that reason and goodwill could make progress possible even when perfection remained forever out of reach. And so the lamp that burned through 84 years finally went dark, the press stopped running, the experiments concluded, the signatures dried on the final documents. But the light he helped kindle, in libraries and laboratories, in civic institutions and constitutional government, in the simple idea that people can shape their own lives and improve their own societies if given freedom and opportunity, that light still burns, still guides, still reminds us what one curious, hard-working, endlessly adaptable human being can accomplish when allowed to flourish. Rest well, Benjamin Franklin. The republic you helped create still struggles to keep itself, still works to become more perfect, still needs the kind of wisdom you exemplified, practical yet principled, ambitious yet humble, serious about truth but never without humor. Your story ends here, but its lessons continue, whispered through the centuries to anyone willing to listen, offering guidance for the long work of building lives and nations that matter, that endure, that make the world a bit better than we found it. And with that gentle thought, let your own journey tonight move from history into dreams, where the lessons of the past become the quiet companions of rest, where stories settle softly into sleep, where the boundaries between then and now fade into the peaceful darkness that carries us toward morning. Good night.